Hello and welcome to the first exciting lecture for human sexuality. In this lecture, we're going to be just covering an introduction to human sexuality, or the psychology of sex. Okay, so the first thing we have to do here is define sex or sexuality. We're going to kind of use these terms interchangeably throughout most of the semester, even though it's not necessarily a hard and fast rule, because as we'll see on the next slide, we've got different definitions for sex and sexuality. But what is sexuality? So first off, sexuality as a term, not sex, but sexuality as a term is a quite new term. It actually came into usage in towards the end of the 18th century in English, French, and German. And typically sexuality meant reproduction through sexual activity. And really there we're talking originally was talking about in plants and animals. It was used in later on in relation to love and sex matters in Europe, but that wasn't until quite a bit after the term sexuality first started. How about if we looked at the dictionary? What does it mean according to the dictionary? Well, that depends a lot on which dictionary you read. Merriam-Webster defines it as the quality or state of being sexual. But depending on what you're looking at and what dictionary you're reading and what researchers you talk to, it can include things like mating rituals. Any mating rituals we have are included in sexuality. But also the laws, customs, and fantasies and art that are all based on sex and sexuality. And then you've got a wide diversity of sexual expression that's going to be classified under sexuality, things we'll talk about throughout the semester. And we do have to ask ourselves, is this a unique human trait? Is sex and sexuality not just sex as in reproduction, but sexuality as in the things that go beyond just sex for reproduction? Is sexuality a unique human trait? And the answer that most scientists will tell you is no, it's not unique. That when we talk about things like mating rituals, you have those in a lot of species. When we talk about the basically diversity in sexual expression, you can have that as variable in species. So it's something that we will look at throughout the semester. Before we go any farther, I have to differentiate sex and gender. We'll talk about this again later in the semester when we talk about um, sexuality in the terms of sexual identity and in the terms of sexual preference. But for now, we need to at least differentiate these two terms. So sex, biological sex, is going to be the physical characteristics that define male and female. And when we look at the physiology stuff, we'll look at this in more detail. But biological sex is going to be these physiological or physical characteristics that define male and female. Gender, on the other hand, is the features that society associates with what's appropriate for men and women. You'll hear this term that I'll use, maleness and femaleness, masculinity and femininity. That's what gender is going to basically refer to. Gender doesn't refer to the bits that you have, the biological bits that you have, whether you're an XX or an XY, whether you have, or even beyond those in chromosomes, which we'll talk about again when we get to that in the chapter. But we're talking about, when we're talking about with gender, we're talking about the features that are associated with maleness and femaleness. Virtually all societies expect the two sexes to take on different gender roles, and gender roles are how maleness and femaleness is expressed. And we'll talk about this again later in the semester. But in these gender roles, these norms generate what's referred to as gender stereotypes, and these gender role stereotypes are basically generalizations about how men and women should express themselves and characteristics each possess. And again, we'll go into this in much more detail later. I just want to get this differentiation between biological sex and gender before we go any farther. So let's do a brief throughout the ages. It's going to be very brief. Uh, even though that's pretty much what most of this lecture is. We'll look at changes in human sexuality over time. So we'll start with ancient Mediterranean. So many of our modern things can be derived back to ancient Mediterranean. There were many sexual issues in writing and art. There you can look at the Hebrew history, the Greek history, and the Roman history, and all of these kind of interact to influence what modern Western society utilizes in addition to the religious doctrines that we'll get to in a minute. One of the things I always want to point out here is uh, during ancient times, there tended to be much more liberal views, liberal as we would classify it today, liberal views on sex and sexuality. There were some more closed things, but there were also many things that were much more open. You see a lot more art from ancient times where the art depicts sexual acts like you see here. You see nudity a lot more expressed in ancient times. A lot of this was destroyed or covered up when we talk about the times that came after, when we'll get back to religion in a minute, specifically Christianity, and how this liberalness of sex and sexual expression was kind of shut down. But one of the things that's interesting to look at here is when we look at specifically, we'll look at this Greek one. In ancient Greece, it was actually very common for just about everyone to be bisexual. And when we come back to talking about sexuality and um, basically sexual identity and homosexuality versus heterosexuality and bisexuality and throwing all the others in the mix, you see that in different times throughout history, when being homosexual or bisexual was more open and accepted, you found that more people were homosexual or bisexual. And this will kind of lend towards what we'll talk about later when we're talking about homosexuality. And uh, you get to this big argument between choice and genetics and all of that. And why is that even an argument in the first place? Besides the point, but we'll talk about that then. But we do when we look at times throughout history where it was more open and accepted, you see more people being homosexual or bisexual. And like I said, during ancient Greece, just about everyone was bisexual. As far as ancient Asia, we can look at that as well because it does have some influence on Western society, even though it has less than the Mediterranean influences. In India, marriage was considered a positive pursuit. However, you ended up with this very patriarchal society. You still see that today. Female infanticide was commonplace. We'll talk about that more later in the semester. But you see this even to modern times where it's very patriarchal. However, in contrast to that, you had things like the Kama Sutra and the nature of love and more openness to things. But at the same time, then you get more into things like uh, male-based polygamy. In ancient China, you had the yin and yang of sexuality. You had a very importance of female orgasm. Polygamy was present there as well as homosexuality. But then again, the other side of it is those were shut down in ways too. So that's where that yin and yang come in. Now we have to transition into early Christianity because the Western view on sex is very much shaped by the 2,000 years of Christianity and Christianity's view on sex. Uh, General association of sex with sin and sexuality and having desire for sex with sin. Celibacy and chastity were idealized. Sex was for procreation only. So there was a long period of time of this. Middle Ages continuing on. There was a period of time in the early Middle Ages where sex was more liberalized, but then it went back the other way. So you're going to see this shift. You're going to see this basically going like this, where sex is allowed and then sex is not allowed. Sex is allowed, sexuality is allowed, sexuality is not allowed. So early for about 100 years, sex was liberalized, but then in the 1400s, 15th century, there was a campaign against witchcraft and about this carnal lust of women. And this was led again by the Catholic Church. Going a little bit beyond that, you have this rise in sensuality, but at the same time, asceticism, which is basically where um, sex and sexuality are suppressed. So women became more educated and politically involved during this time, but then we go back to that other end of it, where there was more witchcraft trials based on men's fears of women's sexuality. So again, you see this period of time where sex is more open, women have more power, then of course back to the other end of it. Women are more oppressed and sexuality oppressed along with that. The Reformation, you see this obligation to reproduce and have marital love. Women became men's partners in all things, not just to have children. Divorce became permitted. But then sex was only permissible in a marital union. Again, this going back and forth of it. Following this, during the Enlightenment, sex for pleasure was again considered natural and desirable. You had this first rise of free love. We see this again in the 1970s, but rise of free love. Periods of time of premarital pregnancy and illegitimate births. But at the same time, homosexuality was condemned and persecuted. Then following this, it went back to uh, conservatism, very conservative sexual attitudes, but not always practiced, by the way. Sexual indulgence was believed to cause many illnesses. There was masturbation prohibition, where you see the devices like this that were put on teenage boys to prevent them from masturbating. Um, but also at the same time, since masturbation was prohibited, um, and this is psychology related, but women were being diagnosed with hysteria. Hysteria comes from the Greek root of uterus. And this hysteria, women were overly emotional because they weren't getting sexual release. So women who were not married, again, masturbation is prohibited, premarital sex is prohibited. So, and they're being diagnosed with sexual pent up sexual tension that is causing them to be overly emotional. So what was the result of it? The result of it was doctors that actually masturbated female patients for them to have orgasm. And this is one of the things when you look at people like Freud, and again, don't expect you to understand that, but once you've taken Intro to Sex, and you should at least know who Freud is, but Intro to Sex, you'll see that one of the things Freud did was he basically uh, assisted masturbation with women. Freud wasn't necessarily a good guy, but that's not important for this class. So you get this assisted masturbation. So there's a lot going on there. Um, and things like vibrators became popular during this time as a way for others doctors specifically to assist women with orgasm to reduce that hysteria. Then we get into the 20th century, and a big change here. The social hygiene movement occurred. Sexology is going on. The sexual revolution, feminism is occurring, even though it kind of started before the 20th century. We've got gay liberation and some more openness to homosexuality. Looking first at the social hygiene movement. So beginning in about 1905, it started to be viewed very strongly about this sexually transmitted diseases and infections, and how basically men were getting STIs from from prostitutes and transmitting it to their partners in marriage. So during this time, there was legislation that required blood tests before marriage to make sure that there wasn't STDs, STIs before that. Prostitutions was outlawed. It had been outlawed in most places, in many places on and off before this, but this is where a lot of our modern prostitution bans came from. On the positive side of this became where there was an early advocacy for sex education in schools. So a lot of our sex education comes back to this because sex education was designed to reduce the spread of diseases. This led to sexology. Sexology is basically the scientific pursuit and understanding of human sexuality. You hear people like Kinsey, who studied American sexual behavior. We've got the modern Kinsey scales, even though they're not the greatest, they are a good resource. You've got Masterton and Johnson, who looked at sexual response physiology, which we'll look at more in this semester. And this really demystified sex and led to a lot of our modern view of how sex works and what is going on with sexual physiology and sexual response. We've got the sexual revolutions of the last century. And there was two big ones, one in the 1920s, where you see like flappers and things like that, and then another big one in the 1960s. And during these two revolutions, values and attitudes about sexuality became more permissive. We see a lot of advertising become more sexualized, for good or worse. The 1960s is where you see a really big shift, though. During this time, hippies were popular, free love. You see that extending into the 70s. The discovery of antibiotics, which got rid of many STDs. Remember that thing I just talked about? STDs, STIs was a big prohibition with sex. Well, now with antibiotics, most of the STDs, STIs are treatable. Pornography became more acceptable. And the big one, I cannot emphasize how big of a deal this one is, the development of contraceptive pill, where sex for pleasure became more acceptable because reproduction would not necessarily occur, unwanted reproduction wouldn't occur with good contraception. Yeah, there were condoms before this and other things that could be done to prevent conception, but they weren't as good as the contraceptive pill is, which is still not foolproof. We'll talk about that later in the semester, though. We get feminism as well. It says beginning in the early 1900s, but actually feminism can be traced back to even the 1800s. But it comes down to the fact that it's none of society's business what a woman should do with her body. You get a lot of things coming from that. Roe versus Wade, of course, been overturned since then. And then the things that have occurred legally even since then to go back to this. None of society's business what a woman does with their body. Birth control literature was published by Sanger. This actually violated the Comstock Act. There was a rule against publishing birth control stuff, but he got arrested for it, but the case was dropped because of public outrage. He actually opened birth control clinics, and that eventually became what is modern Planned Parenthood organization. Beginning in the mid 1900s, we have more of the gay liberation. So prior to this, homosexuality was viewed as perverting or preying on youth. Some people still view it this way, unfortunately. Um, there's many medical cures that have been attempted. We'll talk about this later in the semester and how just horrible they are and how much they actually cause psychological harm. 1969, police raided Stonewall, which was a gay bar, and the gay community resisted for the first time. The APA removed homosexuality from the DSM. Prior to that, it was viewed as a disorder. It was removed as a disorder. 1970s was the golden age of gay liberation. However, the 1980s, the AIDS epidemic, which was spread throughout the gay population rather prolifically. I can't pronounce it right now, but that put I wouldn't say a halt, but it delayed some of the progress towards openness to homosexuality. And then, of course, I've got an asterisk here for same-sex marriage because it didn't happen in the 1900s, but since then, in the last 20 years or so, there's been a lot of progress towards same-sex marriage, making it legal. It's legal everywhere in the US right now, even if people are trying to restrict it still. But there's a lot more openness to it now. Another thing that we will talk about later in this semester. Okay, that's all I have for this first one. I don't even have a review slide. I just wanted to get this first very brief 20-minute introduction to kind of human sexuality and some of the things we're going to look at throughout the course. Thanks. Come on back.